Okay, let's begin by praying that the schools of our learning should help to bring home the hostages and protect our soldiers and Am Yisrael and all of the innocents and bring a speedy end to this war.
Amen.
Um, Now, last week, we looked at the beginning of this sugya where Reish Lakish asked this question. Why wasn't there an azhara mentioned? The words, why doesn't the Torah tell us specifically there's an azhara for Yinui? So what does that mean? What's his question? What is an azhara? And what is he asking?
So an azhara would be a specification of penalty attached to and formulated as an if you don't do attached positive. In other words, it says if you don't do X, Y will happen.
Okay, not exactly. You're confusing terms, but it's okay. You're on the right track. The azhara is supposed to be a pasuk in the Torah that tells us the lav. It tells us what you're not supposed to do. And then there's supposed to be another pasuk that tells us the onesh, tells us the punishment. So he wants to know, why isn't there a specific lav in the Torah about Inui? In other words, because the way we see the Torah just talks about Inui, it's not using the language of azhara. So he answers himself by saying Mishum delo efshar, because it's impossible to write this in a way, in a conventional way. It's impossible for the Torah to phrase this Isur as a regular azhara, because he says, Heichi nichtov, how would we write it? Nichtov rachmana lo yochal. Let the Torah write, one shouldn't eat on Yom Kippur. Then what? Then achila b'kazayit. So what's the problem with saying lo yochal?
Because the measure for abstaining from eating, for example, on all the other fast days, is different from the measure for abstaining from eating as a function of unui, as a function of unui.
Okay, and yet also just to correct you, that achila in general is measured because we're not talking about other fast days. Right. There are no other fast days in the Torah. There's only one fast day.
Nachon. Right.
Okay. So what does he mean, achila b'kazai?
That's, and if it's saying don't eat, then one would assume that the measure is the measure for achila in general.
Right. So in all the other places where the Torah tells us not to eat X, not to eat chametz on Pesach, not to eat a nevela, not to eat treifa or any of these other things, that measure is in the kazayit. And why is that a problem?
Because the measure for Yom Kippur, eating or not eating as a function of the nui is a different measure.
And that measure is?
Hagassah.
Kikotevet Hagassah. Okay, so in other words, his objection, he says the Torah couldn't have written lo yochal, because then that would imply that you're not allowed to eat a kazayit. But actually, the Isur is to not eat a kikotevet hagassah, which is a larger measure. So that's out. Nichtov rachmana lo tu'una. So let the Torah write lo tu'una, don't afflict. Kumecho mashma, get up and eat, would be the implication. In other words, if you write out the lashon of inui as an azhara, as an isur, then it implies the opposite of what you want, what the Torah wants you to do. It'll imply that you should eat. So that's Reish Lakish. He says the reason the Torah doesn't write Ashara is because you can't. There's no way to do it. So then this gets challenged by Rav Oshia. Rav Oshia gets is nidche. We have Rav Bibi Barabai who also challenges and says there's a way of doing it. He's also nidche. And then we have Rav Ashi who challenges and he says, let the Torah write Al Tasur Min Ha'inui. Do not turn away from Inui. And as Rashi says, in other words, Rashi puts it in a language that the Torah might write. Hishamer Shetitanen. Be careful or guard yourself that you should be mitaneh. Then that would be. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That's from a previous. That's from the previous thing, not from here. Hishamer Devava. That's one of the things that Gemara pushes away. Excuse me. Rashi doesn't comment here. Al tasur min ha'inui would be. It would have to be like. Yeah. Al tasur min ha'inui. The lashon of inui though it would not be there, but okay, the Torah could have phrased it in some similar kind of way, and then it would be in the lashon of azhara, and then I would know that the Torah, the Torah gave me a regular azhara. So this in the Gemara is kasha. So the Gemara leaves Rav Ashi's challenge unchallenged, meaning in principle the Gemara is saying, Rav Ashi is saying that Reish Lakish is wrong. The Torah could have written this in a lashon of azhara. Why didn't it? We don't know. Gemara doesn't say. So now we're going to embark on a longer sugya. The next part of the Gemara is really taken from the Sifra, from the Torat Kohanim, which we're going to look at. But we'll start a little bit here, and then I'm going to show you some of the other sources. So Tana Ma'iti La Mehacha. So the Tana brings it from here. That is, as Rashi explains, Tana Ma'iti, the Tana brings Azhara Bi'inui Mehacha. The Tana brings, in other words, the Tana is going to learn that there's an Azhara of Inui from here. And this is going to open up into a long drasha. So before we go into this longer drasha, let's remind ourselves of some of the psukim that are involved. Make sure you see what I'm seeing. There we go. So I color-coded the the psukim. These are all the psukim that deal with Isur Melacha and Inui on Yom Kippur. So let's look at them. So the first ones we learned in Parshat Acharei Mot. And there it says, Vayta lachem l'chukat olam b'chodesh hashvi'i b'asur l'chodesh ta'anu et nafshotechem v'chol melacha lo ta'asu hazrach lager hagar b'tochechem. So in the mindset that we're embarking on now, and based also on what we already learned, so here we see two things. We see the Torah says, Ta'anu et nafshotechem. This is the first mention of Inui on Yom Kippur. And Melacha. And regarding Melacha, it says Lo Ta'asu. So the Azhara of Melacha here seems to be very clear. This is a classic Azhara. Kol Melacha Lo Ta'asu. Don't do Melacha on Yom Kippur. Unlike Ta'anu et Nafshotechem, which is not given in the lashon of azhara. Ki v'yom hazeh yechaperchem t'eretchem mikol chatotechem v'knei Hashem titaru. Shabbat Shabbaton hilachem v'initem et nafshotechem chukat olam. So one of the things that we're going to bear in mind here is that there's a seeming repetition of Tanu et nafshotechem and V'initem et nafshotechem. And what do we get out of that? Then we skip over to Parshat Emor. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Emor. Ach v'sor l'chodesh hashviyi ze Yom HaKippurim hu. Mikra kodesh yeh lachem v'initem et nafshotechem. Ikravtem yishel Hashem. If you caught on to my color coding, so the Inuyim are in green, Malacha is in yellow, and the Azhara or the punishment is going to be in red. Okay, so far we have now 3 psukim of Initem. This is our second instance of Malacha, right? The first one we had in Achrei Mot, and now we have a second instance. B'chol Malacha lo ta'asu, again, brought as an Azhara, be'etzem hayom hazeh, ki Yom HaKippurim hu l'chaper lechem lifnei Hashem Elokechem, ki kol hanefesh asher lo tu'neh be'etzem hayom hazeh, v'nichrita me'ameh. So now we have the onesh of not being mu'uneh. This is where we get the onesh. We still don't have a lashon of azhara, but we have the lashon of onesh. B'chol hanefesh asher taseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh, v'ha'avadati et hanefesh shahim mikerav hama. So here again we have melacha and the onesh. Kol melacha lo tasu. The repetition, third time we've had this pasuk of melacha lo tasu. V'kato lamidor v'lechem b'chol moshvotechem. Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem v'initem et nafshotechem. Again, I have another lashon of inui, another pasuk of inui, without really any chidush in terms of the way it's presented. But it ends off by saying b'tisha b'chodesh ba'erev me'erev ad erev tishpetu shabbatchem. Okay, so we'll come back to this pasuk because we always thought that Yom Kippur starts on the 10th, and here it says on the 9th, and the 9th of the Chodesh. So what is that? And then the last instance we have is in Parshat Pinchas with the Musafim. It says, "Basur lechodesh hashviyi zamikra kodesh yelachem v'yinitem et nafshotechem kol melacha lo tasu." So now, part of this is going to be a numbers game. So let's just keep track of the numbers. How many psukim do we have of Malacha? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 places that the Torah tells us not to do Malacha on Yom Kippur. And one of those places gives us the onesh, which is v'ha'avadati et hanefesh shahim mikerav hama. That's what we have with Malacha. What do we have with Inui? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 4 instances of Inui. Oh, 5. No, more. Wait, I think I'm missing some. 1, 2 in Achrei Mot. 1, 2, 3 in Emor. That's 5. And then I have the 6th one in Parshat Pinchas, and one of them has the onesh, the nichrita me'ameh. Okay, so these are things to keep in mind because the Medrash is going to try to account for all of these psukim. The focus is going to begin with melacha. So now, let me transport you, as it were, to the Torah Kohanim. Okay, Torah Kohanim, also known as the Sifra. This is in Parshat Emor, the beginning of Perek Yud Dalet. Mikra Kodesh Yom Kippurim hu v'nitem et nafshotechem Kippurim hu. Oop. Wait, sorry. Oh no.
Speaking of Purim,
What's that? So we're coming back to here. The Torah Kohanim is coming back to here to the beginning of this parsha Namor. Ach v'sol l'chodesh hashvi'i as a Yom Kippurim hu mikra kodesh yelachem v'initem et nafshotechem v'kraftem mishel Hashem. Then it says v'chol melacha lo tasu ve'etzem hayom hazeh ki Yom Kippurim hu v'chaper lechem l'fnei Hashem Elokechem. And then ki kol hanefesh asher lo tu'neh be'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichratam yaman. So you'll see we're going to learn out something about this lashon of be'etzem hayom hazeh. What is that going to imply? So let's go back. I accidentally cut out the sifra, but it'll come up again. Just a sec. Okay. Ikra Kodesh, Yom Kippurim hu v'initem et nafshotechem ki Kippurim hu. B'chol melacha lo ta'asu ki Kippurim. Shiachol ein li elo Yom Kippurim mechaper, elo im kein asa'o mikra Kodesh. This first part of the Sifra, it's not immediately relevant to our sugya, but we're going to look at it. This is the beginning of the series of drasha. So the first drasha could be that Yom Kippur won't bring atonement unless you make it into a Mikra Kodesh. V'hitaneh v'lo asa bal melacha. So what would that imply? It would mean that you would have to be mitaneh and not do any melacha. So the idea is that maybe there's no kapara from Yom Kippur unless you're mitaneh and you didn't do melacha. Lo karao mikra kodesh, v'lo nitaneh b'lo asa melacha minayin shehayom mechaper. Skipping the round parentheses and going to the brackets. So from where would I learn that, let's say you didn't do any of those things, and how would you know that Yom Kippur could still be mechaper? Talmud Lomar Yom HaKippurim Hu Shiachol Talmud Lomar Yom HaKippurim. It's a day of atonement, meaning you saw Yom Kippurim is repeated. So it's repeated to tell you that it's a day of kapara, even if you don't make it a Mikra Kodesh. Ushiachol, Ainli Yom HaKippurim mechaper, Ela ima korbanot ve'im asirim, Yom HaKippurim mechaper, minayin afal pi she'ein korbanot ve'ein seir hayom mechaper. So we could also think, based on what we learn here and from Achrei Mot, that it's only going to be mechaper if you do all of the tekes of the korbanot and the seirim and so forth. How do I know that it's mechaper even if you don't do any of that? Again, in other words, it's to tell you this repetition of Yom Kippurim, it's still a day of atonement. Then let's take it a step further. Maybe it's mechaper on people who did tshuva and people who didn't do tshuva. In other words, it's mechaper for everybody, regardless. And I would say the dinhu. Dinhu literally means that it's a judgment, or it's a law. But here, and we've used this before. Dinhu means that I could learn this out as a kal v'chomer. That's what it means. In other words, I can learn it out through reasoning. That dinhu chatat v'asham mechaprim. In other words, throughout the rest of the year, korban chatat or korban asham are brought, for the most part, to bring kapara to the people who are bringing those korbanot. So chatat v'asham mechaprim, v'yom kippurim mechaper. Ma chatat v'asham ein mechaprim ela al hashavim. Af yom kippurim lo yichaper ela al hashavim. In other words, I could learn it out. This question about whether or not Yom Kippurim is mechaper, whether or not you do tshuva, I could learn it out the din from the din of chatat and asham. So, in other words, where else do I have a place where the Torah says that you do this to get kapara? I have it by chatat v'asham. And I learn out elsewhere, not here, I learn out elsewhere that chatat and asham aren't mechaper unless the people who bring them did tshuva. So I'll say, just like chatat v'asham are not mechaper unless you did tshuva, also Yom Kippur is only going to be mechaper for people who do tshuva. But the Sifra pushes back. Although, im amar b'asham v'chatat, shein mechaprim al hazadon kishkaga. Says no. The comparison doesn't work because if you say, in other words, you could say by asham and chatat, they're not mechaper for somebody who did the isur, whatever the isur was, on purpose. They did it bizadon kishkaga. That is, if you violate a commandment bizadon b'mezid, you don't bring a korban. There isn't a korban for a mezid. There are a couple of exceptions, but the vast majority of chatat and hashamim are brought when you did an isur bishkaga. So let's say if you're mechalel Shabbat b'mezid, you're not in the din of a korban. So even if you brought a korban, it won't be mechaper. So im amart b'asham v'chatat she'ein mechaprim al hazadon kishkaga. They're not mechaper for somebody who violated a commandment b'mezid, the way they're mechaper for somebody who violated a commandment kishkaga. Tomar b'yom kippurim she'mechaper al hazadon kishkaga. If you can't say that by Yom Kippurim because Yom Kippurim is mechaper both for people who were over on averod b'mezid, the same way it's mechaper for people who are over bishkaga. Ho'il b'hu mechaper al hazadon kishkaga, yechaper al hashavim ve'al sheinan shavim. So then I go back to my original contention. So maybe Yom Kippur is not like other kinds of kapara, like chatat v'asham, and it will be mechaper for people whether or not they do tshuva. Tamud lamar, ach, ha'eino mechaper ela al hashavim. The Torah says ach, and the Gemara understands this word. You see from the Sifra, the Gemara understands from this the idea of ach, that ach is mechalek. Where does it say? Ach right, it says ach be'asor lachodesh hashvi'i yazeh Yom Kippurim hu. So the ach would seem to be superfluous because it could have just said be'asor lachodesh. So the way Chazal understood ach, it's mima'et. It's going to exclude something. It's going to divide. It's going to show us some kind of a division within this category. So the division is going to be that Yom HaShvi'i, Yom Kippurim is going to be Chodesh HaShvi'i, Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippurim will be mechaper for people who do tshuva, and not for people who don't do tshuva.
Yeah.
Yes.
I thought the avodah of the Kohen Gadol is brings kapara to all Am Yisrael. So
Yeah.
why is it here? It seems that it's not true.
It's not that what we learned from here is that it won't be mechaper except for people who do tshuva. But it will be mechaper even for people who did things b'mezid. We'll get to this issue when we get to the end of the parak, right? We saw in the Mishnah, but the Mishnah, I'll just remind you, hold on a second. Let's see which. This is the next to last Mishnah in the 8th parak of Yoma, Chatat v'Asham, Chatat v'Asham Badai. There's an Asham Badai and Asham Tadui. So the Chatat and an Asham Badai, the Chaprim, those are two vehicles of Kapara, Chatat and Asham. Mita v'Yom Kippurim Mechaprim im hatshuva. Death is a kapara, and Yom Kippur is a kapara, provided you do tshuva. And then it says tshuva mechaperet al averot kalot al aseh ve'alot aseh ve'al chamirot utoleh ad sheyavo Yom Kippurim yichaper. We will get into this lashon later. We learned it a little bit when we learned it the first time, but you see that this conclusion of the Sifra is embedded also into the Mishnah. That Yom Kippur is mechaper with tshuva. Let's go back to the Sifra. Okay, now we're getting up to the part of the Sifra. We're getting close to the part of the Sifra that our Gemara is going to do. V'chol malacha lo ta'asu be'etzem hayom hazeh, harei zu azhara limlacha. So we saw this, all right? Not allowed to do any malacha on the etzem hayom hazeh, in the body, in this, the main part of this day. And we'll look at this word be'etzem. Harezu azhara l'mlacha. So this is the azhara from the Torah, telling you that you're not allowed to do melacha on Yom Kippur. Kol hanefesh asher ta'aseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh ve'avadati, right? Ve'avadati et hanefesh hu mikerav hama harezu onesh l'mlacha. So here we see this is a classic case where the Torah, the Sifra is pointing out that the Torah first gave us the azhara, kol melacha lo tasu, and then it gave us the onesh. All right, kol nefesh sher tasam kol melacha b'etzem hayom hazeh ve'avadati. Okay. Ki kol hanefesh asher lo tu'uneh be'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichrita harei zu onesh nimu. So this is the pasuk that tells us that there's an onesh. You get a punishment if you're not mitaneh on Yom Kippur. V'ha'avadati ma Talmud amar. So, what's this lashon v'ha'avadati that we saw by Malacha? By Inui it says v'nichrata. By Malacha it says v'ha'avadati. Ma Talmud amar. So, what is the Torah telling us with this? V'fi shehu omer karet b'chol makom ve'eni yodea mahu. Right? It says in all other places or many other places when it introduces a punishment of karet, it just says karet. It says v'nichrata. Kishu omer v'ha'avadati limeid al hakaret she'eno ela avdan. So now v'ha'avadati is there to tell me something about karet. It explains to me something about karet. That karet is avdan. It's I'm jumping to say lost, but I'll explain it in a minute. But it's that karet, the Malbim here in this Perush on the Sifra explains that karet means to cut off, right? V'havadati means I'm going to cause a loss. So he says like this: the karet, it's like if you cut the tree down to its roots, then it's cut off. Havadati, the idea of havadati, of abdan, is associated with loss. It means that it moved places. It went somewhere else. And what he says is this fits in with the Chazal say, it's a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that says that Rishaim are nidon to Gehinom for 12 months. In other words, they're put in another place for 12 months. That's B'havadati et nefesh. But it's not necessarily a complete cutting off. So the Havadati is supposed to be an explanation of karet, that it limits what we might think karet would be. The idea of what karet is actually the subject of Machloket Rishonim, and we will not delve into that right now. I'm just going to read through this. מניין שיום הכיפורים אסור באכילה ובשתייה וברחיצה ושיחה ותשמיש המיטה ומילת הסנדל. So from where do I know that all of these Chamesh Inuyim, where do I learn them from the Torah? Talmud Lomar Shabbaton Shvut, because the Torah calls Yom Kippurim a Shabbaton. Shabbaton is Shvut or Shvot, that you have to stop doing something. So the Shvut is to stop doing all of these Inuyim. Yachol Tehei Shabbat Bereshit Asura Bekulam. So Torah, the Yom Kippurim is called Shabbat Shabbaton. So maybe you'll say that Shabbat Bereshit, in other words, the Shabbat that comes every week, is also Asur in all of these Inuyim. Talmud Lomar Shabbaton ki lachem, Shabbaton hu lachem b'yinitem. That we just saw the pasuk in Amor, right? That Yom Kippurim is Shabbaton hu lachem b'yinitem. Hu Asur. This Shabbaton hu, this particular Shabbaton of Yom Kippurim, that's the one that's Asur in all of these Inuyim. Vein Shabbat Bereshit Asur b'kulam. And Shabbat Bereshit is not Asur. Okay. V'initem et nafshotechem b'tish'a. So now we have this pasuk that says, you do the Inuyim, you're supposed to be mitaneh on the 9th of the month. So how can that be? Because the Torah says elsewhere that it's on the 10th of the month. So Drasha says, Yachol yatchil v'yitaneh b'tisha. So maybe based on this, you would say that one has to begin fasting on the 9th. Talmud Lomar ba'erev, but the Torah says ba'erev. Let's look at the pasuk again. Shabbat Shabbaton hu lachem, v'initem et nafshotechem, v'tish'a lechodesh ba'erev, me'erev ad erev tishbetu Shabbatchem. So if I have this pasuk that says v'tish'a lechodesh, then you would say you have to start fasting on the 9th. But then the Torah says ba'erev. Talmud Lomar ba'erev. I ba'erev yachol mishatech shach. So if the Torah, now that the Torah says that you start in the evening, maybe that means only after dark. That erev means only after dark, meaning that it has to be now on the night of the 10th that you start fasting. Talmud Lomar v'initem et nafshotechem b'tisha. That it already said before that you have to do the inui, you have to start the inuyim already on the 9th. HaKetzad. So how does that work? Matchil mitaneh mibod yom, shekei mosifin michol al hakodesh. So it tells you that you have to start to be mitaneh while it's still day. In other words, at the end of the day of the 9th, because you have to add from chol, which is the 9th, onto the kodesh, which is the 10th. So I think we mentioned this last time, but this is one of the sources for this concept that you're mosif chol al kodesh. So I think what we said last week is, in principle, when the Torah gives us any, like Shabbat or Yom Kippur or any of the holidays, they're on specific days, and each day is 24 hours. So it would mean, in principle, that let's say you have to keep the fast of Yom Kippur for 24 hours. But there's this concept that you're mosif michol al kodesh. You add from the chol, both before Yom Kippur and after Yom Kippur. You add onto it. And this is a source. This is what the source for the Sifra, that you have to add on from chol onto the Kodesh. So you end up fasting before the end of the day of the 9th and into the night of the 11th. The Malbim here
Is
also,
this also true for Shabbat?
and it's also
Sure.
true for Shabbat. Yes.
On Shabbat you shouldn't work, and this not to work starts in the evening. Although there is no korban. As a matter of fact, the korban is only in the morning. So
Here I'll show you.
nowadays you have no korbanot, but let's say that how was it when there were korbanot? So for the Bet HaMikdash, Shabbat was started in the morning when they did the korbanot for Shabbat. But people should start not doing work in the evening before.
So,
but is this? I don't know.
But here, let me give you a little bit more background. So that's the day of the Sifra, which we'll see. The Sifra is Rabbi Yishmael. That's the day of Rabbi Yishmael. So I'm showing you here. There's a sugya in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Taftet Amud Aleph, that talks about this question. U'demosifim echol al kodesh minara. Where do I learn out that you have to be mosif chol al kodesh in general? In other words, for Shabbatot, for Yamim Tovim, for Yom Kippurim, where do I learn it out from? Tanya, I learn in a Braita, Becharish v'Katzir Tishbot. Right, so this is the first commandment regarding Shemitah. I'm sorry, but I'm not Shemitah. This is regarding Shabbat. Hold on. Here. This is at the end of not the end, but it's in Parshat Kitisa. There's a series of mitzvot, and one of them here, Sheshet Yamim Tavod v'Yom Hashvi Tishbot, v'Charish v'Katzir Tishbot. So what's the drasha? V'Charish v'Katzir Tishbot. Rabbi Kiva omer eino tzarich lomar Charish v'Katzir shel Shvi'it sherei kvar de'amar tzadcha lo tizra v'gomer. So the Torah wouldn't have to tell us about Harish v'Katzir of Shemitah, because I learned it out already. Rashi says, Dal Korchaf af al gav duration dekram b'Shabbat kai, even though the beginning of this pasuk is talking about Shabbat, dichtiv sheshet yamim tavod. Seife, the end of the pasuk, Rabbi Akiva is saying, Ashvi'it kai, is talking about Shemitah. Di Shabbat, because if you'd say it's talking about Shabbos, Harish v'Katzir hu dasur, Shar malachot misharu, who allowed you to do other malachot. In other words, Rabbi Akiva is saying that the indication is, since it's talking about specific, the end of the pasuk is talking about specifically Harish v'Katzir, it's really talking about Shemitah. Rabbi Akiva omer eino tzarich lomar Harish v'Katzir shel Shvi'it sherei kvar me'amar. So then I have a problem, because I already have a pasuk that tells me that in Vayikra, v'shana Shvi'it Shabbat Shabbaton yiyeh la'aretz Shabbat Hashem tzadcha lo tizra v'charvacha lo tizmor. Etzafir kitzircha lo tiktzor v'yadinvei nizirecha lo tiktzor shnat Shabbaton yiyeh la'aretz. right? Like ta Shabbat haaretz achen lachal lachal v'dachal v'amtecha v'skircha v'teshotcha hagarim imach. In other words, I already have the idea that I'm not allowed to do charish v'katsir from elsewhere. So, in other words, this is the way he's building it up. The pasuk, in the beginning, seems to be talking about Shabbat, and then it seems to be the end of the pasuk seems to be talking about Shemitah. But if it's talking about Shemitah, then it seems to be superfluous because I already know that I can't do charish katsir on Shemitah. Ela charish v'nemar tzarcha lo tizra. Ela charish shel erev shvi'it anipnas l'shvi'it v'katsir shel shvi'it ayotze l'motzei shvi'it. So he says the chidush here is that it's telling you that there's a charish and a katsir that you're not allowed to do. That's not specifically in the year of Shemitah itself. Rather, it's going to be before and after. And you have to, meaning you have to be Mosif Chol, the 6th year, onto the 7th year, and the 8th year to the 7th year. You have to stop doing Charish v'Katsir, not right before Shemitah, but somewhat before Shemitah. And you can't start in right away with Charish v'Katsir right after Shemitah. You have to have some time after. That's just the plain shot of what Rabbi Akiva is saying. I'm not going to delve into it further, but Rabbi Akiva says, therefore, that I learned from this pasuk, B'charish v'Katsir Tishbot, that's where Rabbi Akiva says, I learned that the Torah tells me that you have to be Mosif Kodesh Al Chol, in general. I learned it out from if I have to do it for Shemitah, it means I have to do it anytime that there's a Moed that's Kodesh. I have to add on to it from the beginning, on the beginning and the end. Then we have...
It's not a gader. It's not just to be sure that when Shabbos really starts, that you already don't work, that you wouldn't get it wrong or something like this. It's not a gader. Is it true what I say? Is it true what I say?
Yes. In other words, the plain shot of Rabbi Akiva is what you're saying, which is this is not a gader mitam chachamim. It's not a gzerat chachamim. This is the way. This is the Torah telling you that you have to add on. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, ma charish reshut, af katsir reshut, yatsa katsir haomer shehu mitzvah. Rabbi Yishmael, but basically what he's doing is he rejects Rabbi Akiva's drasha on charish v'katsir to say that it's there to add Tosefet Chol Kodesh from the beginning and the end. He says, no, it means something else. That just like charish, just like plowing is not a mitzvah, not something you have to do. And also katsir is not something you have to do. Yatsa katsir ha'omer shehu mitzvah. So that excludes the case where katsir is a mitzvah, which is that you have that the Torah commands you to do katsira in this instance. That the Torah says you do have to harvest the omer. So, hold on. Rabbi Yishmael Mechari, right? So Rashi explains. Shabbat. The Torah here is it's really only talking about Shabbat. It's not talking about Shemitah the way Rabbi Akiva is saying. K'diktiv bei u'v'yom hashvi tishbot b'charish v'katzir tishbot. So what is charish v'katzir? What is it coming to teach you? Ma charish ein lecha charish shel mitzvah. So it's telling you just like there's no mitzvah of plowing and a field lizro l'tzorach omer u'shtei alechem. There's no mitzvah even to plant the seeds that you will need to grow for the omer and ultimately to bring the shtei halechem. There isn't a mitzvah of doing that planting. Shari matzah charush eno choresh, because if you found ground that was already plowed, you don't have to do the charisha when you plant. Ani osro lecha b'Shabbat. And I, Hashem, I'm telling you, you're not allowed to do the charish on Shabbat. Af katzir shani oser lecha, b'shel reshut ani oser lecha. So just like when I tell you b'charish v'katzir tishbot, just like charish, there's no mitzvah charisha, and I'm telling you, you're not allowed to do charisha. I'm also telling you, you're not allowed to do ktsira. That's reshut. It's just something that you do of your own volition. Mitzvah. But then the implication is that it excludes a ktsir that the Torah commands you to do. Shafilu matzah katsur, even if you found the omer that it was already cut down, right? In other words, maybe the wind blew it or something, and it's no longer attached to the ground. Mitzvah li ktsur. The Torah tells you specifically, ktsar tem, you have to. There's a mitzvah of doing ktsira. V'yeshecha l'mod mikan shedocha to Shabbat. This ktsira of ktsirat omer is docha Shabbat. What's Rabbi Yishmael's point? Just to simplify it, Rabbi Akiva says, I learned from the pasuk Becharish Katzir Tishbot. I learned from that Tosefet Shvi'it right before and after that I have to add on. I have to be Mosif Chol Kodesh. Rabbi Yishmael says, no, I don't learn that from that pasuk. The whole point, why does the Torah talk about Charish Katzir Tishbot? To tell me that in general, you're not allowed to do charish, you're not allowed to do plowing and harvesting on Shabbat for things that you want to, like you do of your own volition, but it's there to exclude the idea that when the Torah commands you to do ktsira, you do it even on Shabbat. So you could do ktsirat ha'omer even on Shabbat. So now, where does Rabbi Yishmael learn that you do Tosefet Chol al Kodesh? Rabbi Yishmael Mosifim Chol al Kodesh Minale. So where does he learn it from? Nafkale Midatanya, and then it's basically the Braita that we just saw in the Sifra. Vinitem et nafsho techem b'tisha, yachu b'tisha. Right? Could say that you have to do the Inui on the 9th. Talmud Omar ba'erev. So once the Torah says, so maybe I'll say the 9th in the evening really means at the end of the day of the 9th after it gets dark on the 10th. Talmud Omar b'tisha, but nonetheless the Torah says b'tisha. Haketzad matchil mitaneh mibod yom. So what does it tell you? That you have to start fasting while it's still day. Teaches you that you have to be Mosif Chol Kodesh. So from here, I would only learn that you have to add on Chol to Kodesh at the beginning of, let's say, Shabbat or Yom Kippur. How do I know that I have to add on at the end of the Chag? Talmud Lomar, me erev ad erev. From this evening to that evening. So if erev before implied that you have to be Mosif Chol HaKodesh, so the erev after also implies that you have to be Mosif Chol HaKodesh. Ainli ela Yom Kippurim. So all of this is based on how I learned this pasuk in Parshat Emor about Yom Kippurim, Shabbatot minayin. How do I know that this applies to any Shabbat? Talmud Lomar Tishbetu. Yamim Tovim minayin. Where do I learn that it applies to Yantiv? Talmud Lomar Shabbatchem. Tishbetu Shabbatchem. These are all ribuyim. They're all superfluous. So I'm going to learn them out. That it's to tell me that it's not just for Yom Kippur. It's Tishbetu means it's also for Shabbat, and Shabbatchem tells me for the other Moadim, which are also called Shabbat. HaKetzad. So how does that work? Any place where the Torah says Shvot, that you have to be Shovet, I have to add Mechol al Kodesh. Then the Gemara goes on and says, and how does Rabbi Akiva learn and so forth? We'll for our purposes, we're going to go back to the Sifra. So we're basically just going to read this again here. Now, this part of the Sifra is not yet in the Gemara. It's on the next Amud. But I'm introducing it here because it's important. It'll be important to understand the context of the rest of the drasha. So let's just read it again. Initem et nafshotechem b'tisha. Yachu yatchil yitzaneh b'tisha Talmud Omar ba'erev. Hi ba'erev yachol mishitach shach. Talmud Omar v'initem et nafshotechem b'tisha. HaKetzad matchil mitaneh mibod yom. Shekain mosifim michal kodesh. So the main thing we need to know from this is that the Sifra understands that you have to be mosif chol al kodesh, and I learned it out in this context of Yom Kippur. And it says ein li ela mefanav, like we're just on the Gemara. So this only tells me I have to be mosif chol al kodesh before. How do I know I have to add on at the end? So Gemara may erev ad erev. Ein li el Yom Kippurim, Shabbat Bereshit minayin Talmud Omar Tishbetzu, Yamim Tovim minayin Talmud Omar Shabbatchem, Ha kol shvita sheta shovet, Ata mosif la ben yilfanav ben yacharav. Okay. That's the part. This part of the Sifra is not. It's not been introduced into our Gemara, but the next part. This is where our Gemara begins. Now, remember, our Gemara. What's the concern of our Gemara? What question does our Gemara want to answer?
Why does it say that Yom Kippur starts on midnight?
No.
Oh, well.
What is our Gemara's question?
What's the source for the Azara for Inuim on Yom Kippur?
Right. So we had Reish Lakish, who said, you can't do it. We had Rav Ashi, who said, it could have done, the Torah could have said it, and then we kind of just leave that. And then we said, the Tana Maiti La Mehacha. The Tana brings it from here, and then it brings this Braita from the Sifra, which begins here. So I think actually I'm going to switch back to the way it's brought in our Gemara. So now, with that introduction, the Tana Maiti La Mehacha. The Tana learns out that there's an Azhara of by Inui from here, and it's the here is this Braita. It's going to be a long kind of discussion. So we'll try to pay attention and put it all together. V'initem et nafshotechem v'chol melacha lo tasu. This pasuk is the pasuk that's brought in Parshat Pinchas. And hold on a second. So we're just going to go with it. There are different girsot here. I'm just going to go with the girsas we have in our Gemara. So, Yachu Yehe Anush Karet Al Tosefet V'Lacha. Could be that you would get punished with Tosefet V'Lacha. We explained last week. Okay, I won't keep you in suspense if you don't remember. Tosefet V'Lacha, Rashi explains it's in the context of this Braita that we were learning in the Sifra. We just finished learning this idea of Tosefet Chol al Kodesh. So when the Braita uses this term of Tosefet Melacha, what it means, what it refers to, is the time that you would add on to Yom Kippur at the beginning or at the end. As Rashi explains, Al Tosefin Lacha, Im lo hosif mechol al hakodesh. One did not add on from chol onto the kodesh of, let's say, Yom Kippur, lahafsik min hamalacha mibod yom, to stop doing malacha while it is still day. So, what's the Braita saying? I have a pasuk. It says, "Initem et nafshotechem v'chol malacha lo ta'asu." So that could tell me that you would be chayav karet if you did malacha in this extra time that's before or after Yom Kippur. Why would I think that? Why would I think that you'll be chayav for this extra time? During this you understand what I'm saying? During this extra time that's not Yom Kippurim itself, but it's this Tosefet. So why would I think I'm chayav karet if I did malacha at that time? Anybody? So at this point, it would just be a logical conclusion, because we just finished learning that there is such a thing as Tosefet Chol al Kodesh, Mosifin Mechol al Kodesh. And as Paul pointed out, this is the Torah telling me this. It's not a Gzeira d'Rabbanan. I'm learning it from the Torah. The Torah says that you have to add on some time from before Yom Kippur on and the end of Yom Kippur. So if the Torah tells me I have to add that on to the day of Yom Kippur, if I'm chayav for doing melacha on Yom Kippur, I should be chayav for doing melacha on the Tosefet of Yom Kippur. It's just it would be just a straight, simple conclusion. So then I would think you could be chayav karet on this extra time for doing malacha, just like you would be on the day of Yom Kippur itself. Talmud Lomar v'chol nefesh she'taseh kol malacha be'etzem hayom hazeh. But I have this other pasuk that says anybody who does malacha be'etzem hayom hazeh v'havarti et hanefesh hahi mikerav hama. Right, so that's this pasuk we saw in Parshat Emor. It says that if you do malacha be'etzem hayom hazeh, then you're chayav karet. We already established that havarti et hanefesh is a perush of karet. Okay, so what did I do? Hang on. How's that for 15 pages? So what's the drasha? Al itzumo shel yom anush karet. Ve'ino anush karet al tosefet melacha. So if I only, so it goes like this. I learned the drasha b'tisha l'chodesh mi'arav ba'erev. That tells me that there's tosefet chol al kodesh. Once I know that, I'll think, okay, I've added on sometime to the beginning and sometime to the end. So if I do malacha during any of that time, I should be chayav karet. Talmud Lamar, but the Torah tells me elsewhere that you're chayav karet when you do malacha be'etzem hayom, during the body of the day, the strength of the day, the main part of the day. So that tells me al itzumo shel yom anush karet. So that's why that pasuk comes. So if you remember in our psukim, right, we had chol nefesh asher taseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh, v'avarti et nefesh hahi mikerav hama. Specifically, when the Torah gives me the onesh of doing melacha on Yom Kippur, it specifically says that you're only chayav be'etzem hayom. So now I know, even though I have to be mosif chol al kodesh, batchila basof, but there's still going to be a difference between the tosefet and the etzem hayom. And what's the difference? That you're not allowed to do melacha at the beginning or the end, but you only be chayav karei be'etzem hayom. Okay. So far, so good. Oops.
So what happens to you if you eat during the Tosefet?
Oh, we're going to
Because
get
you don't get the onesh.
exactly, but we're going to get to that because this bright is going to bring it up. Now, again, remember, the whole thing that we're trying to prove here is that the Torah did give us an azara for inui, or there's something like an azara for inui. We haven't gotten to it yet. We're building up to it, but at this moment, yes. So we think, okay, I have the Kodesh itself, I have the Tosefet Kodesh, and now I've differentiated between Etzem Hayom, which is the main Kodesh, and the Tosefet. That you're chayav for doing melacha be'etzem hayom and not b'tosefet hayom. All right. So far, so good. Yachol lo yehe anush karet al tosefet melacha, aval yehe anush karet al tosefet inui. So now I'll say, okay, so you've proven to me that I'm not chayav karet if I do melacha on this tosefet of the day, but maybe I'm chayav karet if I'm not mitaneh on the tosefet. Exactly your question. Talmud Lamar, kichol hanefesh asher lo tuneh be'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichreta me'ameh. Right, that was one of the other psukim that we saw there in Parshat Emor. Here, v'chol hanefesh, right? We had kol melacha lo tasu, ki kol hanefesh asher lo tuneh v'nichreta. V'chol hanefesh asher taseh kol melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I just read through it. So again, it relates specifically the onesh of karet for inui is specifically be'etzem hayom. In the same way that it was for melacha, that melacha you're not allowed to do be'etzem hayom. And if you do, that's when you get the punishment. Okay, so yachol lo yehe anush karet al tosefet melacha. So it could be you don't get karet for doing melacha during this time of tosefet, but maybe you do get karet for not being mitaneh during the time of tosefet. Talmud Damar, but there's a pasuk that tells me specifically that's not the case. Kichol nefesh asher lo tuneh be'etzem yom hazeh v'nichreta me'ameh al itzumo shel yom anush karet. Okay, so what have we established so far? That there's such a thing as etzem hayom of Yom Kippurim, and there's such a thing as tosefet. And on etzem hayom, you're chayav if you do melacha, and you're chayav if you're not mitaneh. And on the tosefet, you're not chayav karet for the melacha or the inui. That's what we've learned so far. Now, Yachol lo yehe bichlal onesh, aval yehe muzhar al tosefet melacha. So maybe this tosefet doesn't include the onesh. Again, so it comes back to this basic idea that we started off with, that the Torah gives us an azhara, which is just saying you're not allowed to do something. And then it gives in a separate place, it'll tell me that there's an onesh if you do it. So now maybe I'll make this chiluk here. Maybe so. What have I shown so far? That if you do melacha during this time of Tosefet, you're not chayav karet. You don't get onesh. So yachol lo yehei bichlal onesh. So maybe it means that this time of Tosefet is not within this category of onesh. You don't get an onesh during that time. But maybe mushar, maybe nonetheless you're not allowed to do it, that the Torah, nonetheless, it tells you you're not allowed to do melacha during this time. Talmud Lamar v'chol melacha lo ta'asu be'etzem hayom hazeh al itzumo shel yom hu muzhar ve'ino muzhar tosefet melacha. That actually even the azhara, even the love of melacha itself only applies to etzem hayom. So at this point, so what does it mean? That the Torah did not tell you that you're not allowed to do melacha on this Tosefet, and it didn't tell you you're not allowed, that you get an onesh on this Tosefet. Since everybody's getting tired, I'm going to just do a little bit more.
I'm really sorry.
No. It's not. First of all, it's not just you, and second of all, I want to read a little bit further, and then I really want you to try to read this yourselves between now and the next time we come back. I was trying to figure out a way of making a chart. In theory, I should be able to make a chart about it, but I want you to try to hold these things in your head. And it's not that, the concepts here are not that difficult, but it's just a matter of like holding them in your head at the same time. So what we've shown so far, again, I'm just going to review from the beginning of the Breita. So we learned from the Breita that we saw in the Sifra before we got to the Gemara, there's such a thing as Tosefet Chol al Kodesh. So now, the next part of the Breita, which is what we're doing in the Gemara, we want to understand what the implications of that are. So what does this Tosefet mean when I say I have to be Mosif Chol al Kodesh? So you would think it means that if you do Melacha during that time, that you'll be Chayav Karet, just like you would be on the Kodesh itself. So actually, no, it doesn't include Karet, because there's a special miyut that says be'etzem hayom hazeh you're chayav karet v'havadati et hanefesh ha'i. So it tells me no, you're not chayav karet. So then I get to this, and then I say, what about inui? Same thing for inui. I'm only chayav for inuyim on Yom Kippurim itself, and not on the Tosefet. So then I'll say, okay, so I'm not chayav karet if I do melacha during this time of Tosefet. But maybe it's nonetheless it's ba'azhara and yehei muzhar. I should still have a love from the Torah telling me I'm not allowed to do it. So now the Breita says no, even that's excluded, because v'chol melacha lo ta'asu be'etzem hayom hazeh. You don't do melacha be'etzem hayom hazeh. O itzumo shel yom hu muzhar ve'enu muzhar tosefet melacha. You're not. There is no azhara. There's no specific isur of doing melacha during this time of Tosefet. Let's go on a little bit further. Yachol lo yehei musar al Tosefet melacha. Okay. So granted, at this point, I'm saying there's no onesh of doing melacha during the time of Tosefet, and there's not even a specific lav telling me I'm not allowed to do melacha during this time of Tosefet. Aval yehei musar Tosefet dinui, but maybe I'll say, nonetheless, there's still an Isur love to be mitaneh during this time of the Tosefet. V'dinhu, and I should learn it out. V'din, uma melacha shnoheget b'shabbatot b'yamim tovim eino muzhar alea. Inui sheino noheg b'shabbatot b'yamim tovim eino din shelo yehei muzhar alav. So what do we got? What's the deal? What's the comparison I'm trying to make, I'll say, look, I'm going to look at the Isur of Malacha. And Isur Malacha is something that you do every Shabbos and Yom Tov. And nonetheless, Eino Muzar Aleh. The Torah doesn't say that you're not allowed to do Malacha during this time of Tosefet. Inui, so what can I say? How does that compare to Inui? Inui, I don't do every Shabbat in Yom Tov. So does that make it more chamur or more kal than malacha?
Or call.
It's more kal because I only do it once a year. Malacha is chamur because I do it every Shabbos and Yom Tov. And nonetheless, there's no azhara not to do malacha during this time of Tosefet. So inui she'no noheg b'shabbatot v'yamim tovim. I'm not chayav b'inuyim on all other holidays and Shabbosim. Eino din, shouldn't it be true then that I'm not mushar during this time of Tosefet on inui? It should be more kal than malacha. And then the Braita says, "Aval azhara li'inu." So okay, so what do I say? So at that point, I'm going to say there's no azhara or onesh of doing malacha during this time of Tosefet. I'm going to learn out b'kal b'chomer that there's no azhara of inui during this time of Tosefet. Say that. But what am I left with? Ava azhara li'inui shel yom atzmo lo lamadnu minayim. But I still haven't learned that there's an azhara to tell me that a specific love that's associated with the inui for Yom Kippur itself. So at this point in the Braita is saying, we haven't yet answered this question of where do I learn the azhara for inui on Yom Kippur. So that's going to lead us into the next part of the Braita, and we're going to stop here, and then we'll pick up next time. Paul, yeah.
What does the halacha, the later halacha, say about this Tosefet?
Well, midioraita, you're not chayav from malacha or inui, but nonetheless, you're supposed to be mosif kodesh al chol. In other words, you're even if there isn't a specific chiyuv. However,
this Tosefet is it the midrabanan or?
No, it is midioraita, but believe that I'll bring you the source for this. I think it's Gemara in Beitzah, that it says the nafka mina halacha is that if you see people who think that you're, let's say, allowed to eat all the way up until Seta Kochavim, you don't have to tell them to stop if you think that they're not going to if they're not going to understand that there's this idea of Tosefet Chol Kodesh. This is one of the places where Gemara says, it's better to let them do it b'shogeg, but not b'mezid. Don't tell them that you're not allowed to do it, because maybe they won't believe you, and they'll eat anyway. But at that point, they'll be mezidim, because they know that they're not supposed to do it. It's a fine point in halacha, but for practical purposes, in other words, l'chatchila, we start the observance miba'od yom.
Yes, that's what we do. So it's how was this decision taken? Because it's not what's written in the Gemara.
So based on what we've learned so far, what we would say is we don't do it because it's asur, we do it because of a positive reason that we learn out that you're supposed to be mosif chol al kodesh. So it's more of a mitzvat aseh than a lo ta'aseh. And so it doesn't mean you're allowed to, you're not, just because there's no Isur love and there's no Onesh, it doesn't mean you're allowed to do Malacha at that time. Because there is an implied assay that you should be Mosif Chol al Kodesh. That's the idea of the Tosefet. It's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. Well, as you remember, we looked back last week at some of these categories of Yisur love
4
that
categories.
we talked about, right? And not so certain things that are mitzvah that are turned into a mitzvah say, even if there's an implied isur. He was talking about in terms of not getting malkot, but sometimes the Torah phrases things in terms of an assay, and sometimes in terms of a lota assay. So the implication here is that this is like an assay. In other words, that you get, like, if you want to put it in more, concrete terms somehow, you'll say that you get a sachar for observing the Tosefet, even if you don't get a punishment if you don't observe the Tosefet. It doesn't mean that you're allowed to do melacha. You're not allowed to do melacha because you have a positive commandment to be Mosif Chol al Kodesh. Okay, I think this is a good place to stop. And so if you want, it might be easier if I send you the dapim, B'li Neder, I'll cut out some of this and send you the dapim. It'll be maybe easier for you to read, and then you can read ahead. And yeah, like I said, I think that the concepts here are not so complicated, but it's just to remember them, put them in place. And I've had the advantage of going over this now a couple of dozen times before Shir. So that's why I say, if you can, try to review this between now and next week. Oh, I'm sorry. So next week we won't have Shir. I will be traveling, but hopefully the week after we will continue. So we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Thank you. And
Thank you. Bye-bye.
נסיעה טובה.
נסיעה טובה.
תודה רבה.
Regards to the Golden Medina.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.